A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing.
Hello and welcome to True Crime News, the podcast covering high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the country every week. No, ladies and gentlemen, your eyes and ears are not playing tricks on you. I am Josh Ritter. I am your host for today, filling in for Anna Garcia. Do not worry, Anna will be back next week. In the meantime, I am going to do my best, and please try to be gentle on me. Our cases for this week include authorities apprehend a suspect they believe is responsible for a crime spree spanning multiple states and countries. The search for the suspect heated up after the assault and murder of a mother of five on a hiking trail in Maryland. Authorities were able to obtain DNA from the victim and tie the suspect to a break-in where a 9-year-old girl and her mother were both assaulted in Los Angeles. This led agents to the murder of a woman in El Salvador, where the suspect was allegedly from before fleeing to the U.S. While the man is awaiting charges, detectives continue to search for other potential victims who may have suffered at the hands of this alleged killer. But first, a man who brutally stabbed his estranged wife as part of what he called a prophecy is found not guilty by reason of insanity. While 3 psychologists agreed the man was suffering severe psychosis at the time of the alleged killing, the victim's family is demanding justice for the brutal murder of their loved one. We are recording this on Thursday, June 20th, 2024. Our guest today is Luis Bolaños, a law enforcement expert, private investigator, and dear friend of the show. Luis, welcome back.
Hi, Josh. Thank you so much. Happy to be here. And I'm very excited about working with you for the first time. I'm a big fan.
I know. We were both talking about that. It's nice to meet you, at least virtually over screens here. I've been a fan of yours for a while, watching you every time you're a guest with Anna. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today, especially given the topics that we're going to be getting into. Let's jump in then. First, talking about Michael Murrah, was found not guilty by reason of insanity for killing his wife, Monica, also known as Star Murrah. Prior to the murder, the marriage between Michael and Monica Murrah was tumultuous at best. Monica alleged that Michael was physically abusive to her and their son, who was 8 years old at the time of the murder. Reportedly, police were called to the couple's home on multiple occasions. However, it appears that no charges were ever filed. In July of 2020, the pair separated and Monica attempted to file a restraining order against Michael, claiming physical and emotional abuse. In the filing, the mother also details Michael's threats to harm himself, writing, "Michael has threatened suicide during arguments. One time he even grabbed a large knife and sat outside our bedroom threatening to kill himself. I'm terrified if he does. What if he kills me and our son?" Luis, this is the part that really started to disturb me about this story, because despite her claims, she was denied the protective order. The response to the order said that a preponderance of the evidence has not been established that there is domestic violence. What was your reaction to that? Were you frustrated by this? I mean, is this where we're seeing the system fail a person yet again?
Yet again. Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. This is another case that seems like it very well could have been preventable. And of course, in the case, none of these are 100% preventable, but my goodness, they could have really, really slowed down the progress of the availability of this clown monster, the husband, to her. And I find it very difficult to believe that all the officers and all the contacts they had responding to a DV call, domestic violence call, that they were not able to find any type of evidence, anything to corroborate what she was claiming. Zero.
Right.
And it is a growing issue. So I think the odds against that are almost nil. You're going to find something, whether it's a statement from the suspect, whether the child was there a witness to this ongoing screaming. We all know domestic violence does not have to be just physical. It could be mental and emotional, or a combination of all three. In this case, it just seems like that had to be there. Those opportunities were there. And I made a note to myself, I would love to review all the body cam footage, all the contacts, if they have them, the reports, the 911 calls, to see if there's any hint of another way of corroborating what she was saying. But this just seems across this country, it's such a um, huge, the threshold is different no matter what state
Yeah.
you're in. Sometimes it's so low to be able to obtain, we're talking about a permanent restraining order. She was granted the temporary one. It was a
Right.
permanent that was denied. And then sometimes it's almost impossible to reach that threshold. So we need some consistency in this country because cases like this, they just seem to be happening more and more. It's horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, you make an excellent point, too, because that was why I pointed out the idea that the court felt that there was not a preponderance of the evidence. That is the lowest standard that we have. We're not talking about beyond a reasonable doubt or even clear and convincing. Preponderance just means more likely than not. So you're saying, to your point, in a case like this, there wasn't enough to even corroborate what she was saying to that extent. And you understand that these systems are many times overwhelmed. They've got, I mean, I know this from experience. They have people, those courtrooms are filled with people bringing restraining orders every single day. The courts take these things seriously because they are going to be limiting somebody's freedom in some capacity. So I understand that they want to take they want to look carefully at each of these cases and not hand out these restraining orders without some thought behind them. But in a case where a person is threatening violence, they have access to a weapon, a knife, which is going to become very important as we can begin to talk about this case more, and that wasn't enough for the judge to just say, you know what? Let's give these people a moment to kind of stay away from each other, especially when one person is already saying that they're afraid and they have a young 8-year-old son.
Right. And early on, Josh, he was already seeking psychological help, therapy help, on some of his issues that he was having that then ended up coming to fruition later. And he had already threatened suicide. There was already these acts of potential violence. I mean, that should have been enough just in itself.
You would think so.
Yeah.
You would think so. To that point, as his mental state deteriorated, Michael sought psychiatric help between August of 2020 and November of 2021. At this time, Michael was reportedly experiencing, and this is what you were bringing out, hallucinations, hearing voices, psychosis, and religious delusion. Is that enough to you? You think the judge should have given that order?
Oh, yes. I would have highlighted that at the top of my affidavit. Absolutely. That would be a starting point. And from that, you can build from that. But clearly that would have been more than enough.
Yeah.
In those courts.
You would hope so. You would hope so, because even if they err on the side of being overly cautious, they may have saved a life, especially in a case like this, where I think you and I see eye to eye that this was something that was preventable, or more should have certainly been done.
Right.
To continue on, the pair was scheduled to appear in divorce court in February of 2022. However, Monica tragically would not survive to see that court date. On November 7th, 2021, Michael went to Monica's home and attacked her while the couple's 8-year-old son was in the house. According to Michael, he barged into the home with a Bible in his hand, speaking to his wife about a supposed prophecy. He then stabbed Monica multiple times, targeting her neck. The couple's son, 8 years old, ran to a neighbor's house following the incident, screaming for help. A responding neighbor found Monica in a pool of her own blood and called 911 immediately. Michael was still in the house at the time, holding the knife, and the neighbor ordered him to leave. Louis, I wanted to pause for a moment can we just talk about the trauma that this young man has experienced at 8 years old? Seeing his father stabbed to death, his mother. I mean, this kid's never going to recover from this, is he?
No, it's going to be with him the rest of his life. It's going to be part of him forever. And that's a whole other side of this that goes under the carpet here. And that, probably, well, very likely not the first time that child has seen that type of behavior, violent behavior, or DV incidents between mom and dad. So everything came to a fruition. But really, what really sticks out to me with what you just went over there, Josh, is the bravery of this kid and his mental wherewithal to run to the neighbor and ask for, and get the neighbor to call 911. And his mom was still alive, so I don't know if she was able to vocalize or communicate with him somehow to go next door, but he did that. And in my mind, he's a hero.
Yeah.
because that if the clown, the monster, would have escaped that scene, you just don't know if he had another prophecy in mind, right?
You are 100% right, and that's something I hadn't thought of. That young man was so brave in that moment. He didn't hide under a table and just wait and see how this whole thing played out. He may have prevented other loss of life by running to the neighbor's house. You're absolutely right to applaud him for all that he was going through in that moment. Grown men like ourselves, I think, would have a hard time handling having seen something like that. And for him to be able to have the wherewithal to go to the neighbors is pretty incredible. Police officers responded to her residence just after 10:30 a.m. and found Michael standing outside with a knife. Officers noted his hands were stained with blood. Meanwhile, Monica was rushed to a local hospital with numerous injuries. However, she succumbed to her injuries later that day. All right, this is where we start to get into a little bit of not an understanding. I think that's probably the wrong word, but a little bit of an insight as to what was going on in this man's mind and what led to later on the defense that his attorneys brought up in court. But according to authorities, Michael was Mirandized at the scene, waived those rights, admitted to stabbing someone he identified as, quote, Star Beast. Remember, her nickname was Star. Michael told the responding officers that he had, quote, killed Star Beast to fulfill a prophecy. Michael believed he was fulfilling a commandment and prophecy from the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Jesus told him to make a sacrifice for the good of all. Okay, and this was something when I was preparing for this, Lewis, that I was particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on. Later, when the police interview Michael, he appeared to be so much more lucid. This is not, after now he's at the scene, still holding the knife covered in blood. He's back at the station. He chillingly tells officers that he, quote, wanted to take revenge on his wife and save their child. This is why I start to get bothered even further by this case. From a legal standpoint, insanity is not, and you know this, insanity is not what we all think of in a common sense of being crazy, being insane. From a legal perspective, it is a person who is incapable of knowing or understanding the nature or quality of what they do, and more importantly, understanding that what they did was morally or legally wrong. So, and I know I'm doing a huge buildup here, but I want to get your thoughts. It's one thing to say, I'm fulfilling a prophecy. I'm doing this for Jesus Christ. I'm doing this for, she's a demon or the star beast or whatever you want to call her. You can believe all of that, but as long as you know what you're doing is wrong, you're not legally insane. He said he was taking revenge. How do you square that? Doesn't that show some sort of understanding of what he's doing?
Oh, absolutely. Those two different things completely. And his defense was, right, based on the three psychologists that evaluated him, was that he was in and out of psychosis. Just never knew when. And in that moment of time when he committed this brutal murder, horrible, violent, brutal murder, he was in some mental state where he just didn't understand what was going around him. And every time I've heard that, I'm sure you too in the past on other cases, and you can see where they're going to be going with this as the investigation continues. You know where they're going, and it's just there's just so many. I call it BS when I hear that. First of all, because 99% of the time it's exactly what it is. So at that moment in time, you're telling me he did not know the difference of right or wrong, which, in my experience, I'm interested to hear your history on this. But it's a very low threshold to prove that he does know the difference between right and wrong. So we've done things when I would get someone a case like this when someone is starting to claim that we'd want to nip it at the bud. There were simple things we would do, right, as investigators for the prosecutor's office and also for the sheriff's department. We would go, either do a surveillance on this individual and see how he handles himself during the day. Yeah. Right? Is he driving? Okay. Well, if he's driving, are there signs posted? Right? Don't turn here, and there's a red light and there's green. He understands right and wrong between those. Right? Yeah. Or a phone call where it's describing how to connect a battery cable to a car to charge another car, something that takes thought, a process, right? But really it's something that's right or wrong. And in this instance, he drove to the house. I don't know how far he drove. I don't know how many laws he had to abide by to get there.
With a weapon. So there's some planning ahead of time
Yes.
with the Bible, right?
So you're telling me he does everything. He knows the difference between right and wrong on the way there. Probably a dozen examples of it as he's traveling to go commit this horrible crime. But the minute he gets out of the car, it all goes out the window. It just sounds so convenient. And, it's a defense that I think with this one, you're going to see probably more and more of these trying to pop up. I'm concerned that it may be, the beginning of an avalanche of these type of cases based on this one. That threshold, everybody's going to want to get in this judge's court.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think anytime you see an insanity defense, people go, wait, okay, let's pump the brakes for a second here, because it sounds like I don't have any other better defense. I don't got an alibi. I don't have a self-defense. I don't have any other explanation for this. So I'm just going to go ahead and say I was crazy. And, not to be overly cynical about it, you do see a lot of cases where they're bringing this defense and there is not much to it. And to your point about how do you mitigate that? Somebody just says, I was insane. I don't know what I was doing at the time, especially when they're claiming temporary insanity. It's not even that I continue to suffer from this, but I was just suffering from it at the time. I had a case where the person had killed their father, very similar to this, killed their father and believed their father was the great dragon. And so it was this same kind of delusion that what they were doing was somehow righteous. And you could see this defense being built in there, but the person ran afterwards. When the police arrived, they ran. They, I believe, if my memory serves me right, they got rid of the weapon, and we were able to show that, listen, those are, we know the term for this, consciousness of guilt actions. Well, if you have consciousness of guilt, that means you understand what you did was wrong. Now, you may have these feelings for why you did it, and those feelings may be there was some sort of righteous cause, but you still know that it was legally wrong or morally wrong what you did. That's why you were hiding it, and that was many times a persuasive argument in these types of cases. Unfortunately, here it did not seem to carry the day.
Right. I wanted to ask you.
Please.
So he's claiming, Josh, of course, that he had issues where he just couldn't understand what was going on. At the scene, and I think at a further interview, they Mirandized him, and he waived Miranda.
Yeah.
How does that affect it down the road? Did he have the ability to understand Miranda, the good and bad of it? And does that put what he said as fruit as a poisonous tree, something that may be susceptible later?
I'm so glad you pointed that out. I thought about that too. Later on, we're going to get into it. He's found fit to stand trial at court too. So, I mean, there are several kind of checkpoints along the way where someone evaluated what he was doing and felt that was fine, except for apparently the murder. We're going to get into it. There was one other wrinkle here I wanted to ask you about. Another potential motive in the crime was uncovered on November 8th of 2021 when Michael's cell phone was mysteriously sent to the court commissioner's mailbox. A judicial assistant received the package with a note containing a passcode to the cell phone and a note which read, "Review Star Murrah and Michael Murrah texts." Michael had a contact list as Star Beast and had text messages exchanged with that person regarding the recent vaccination of their son. This was so bizarre to me, and the motive being that perhaps this was a marital conflict gone completely haywire regarding vaccinations, but this idea that somebody secretly dropped this off. What do you make of that? You ever dealt with something like that before?
Absolutely. People have a variety of reasons why they don't like to take stuff directly to law enforcement. They want to stay anonymous. And who knows, maybe they feared for their safety. And it sounds like with this clown around that's justified. But, I don't know why they didn't come forward, because if they had that information in the cell phone, they knew how to get in it. So it's obviously somebody close to the victim, and enough to know her passcode.
Right.
Maybe they knew more that could have helped give that a reason behind it. And if they would have, that might have been enough to show his mental state.
Yeah, yeah,
Nicer,
very
better.
good point.
Yeah.
Very good point. We don't know. Stories have never revealed who the source was, but you're right. Maybe that person didn't want to be involved, but perhaps they should have in retrospect. Michael was charged with first-degree murder. He was detained on $2 million bond. He pleaded not guilty to the charges on November 19th, 2021. In December of that year, a judge ordered a competency hearing. This was what I was talking about for Michael, where the court ultimately deemed the man was fit to stand trial. Now, there's a difference here, just so everybody understands, between being fit to stand trial and a legal insanity defense. Here, the judge is making the finding that it's a very low standard. Can they essentially effectively participate in their own defense? Do they know they're on trial? Do they know who the judge is? Do they know who the prosecutor is? Do they know who their attorney is? And can they answer their attorney's questions? So much lower standard. But to your point, Lewis, what we were talking about earlier, when being Mirandized, obviously people are looking at this person and realizing they can function enough, correct?
Right. Yeah.
But apparently not enough to be held responsible for murder.
Yeah, that's why we call BS on this.
Okay.
something amiss there. Something amiss.
The murder charge was eventually upgraded to a count of aggravated first-degree murder, which would carry a sentence of life without parole if convicted. During the trial, and this is what you mentioned earlier, 2 forensic psychologists testified that Michael was undergoing psychosis at the time of the incident. Meanwhile, a 3rd forensic psychologist submitted a written report corroborating the findings of the other 2 experts. While the psychologists did not reach a consensus on a specific diagnosis, they unanimously agreed that Michael was not in his right state of mind at the time of the murder, and here's their crucial finding: he could not tell right from wrong. Michael Morin was found not guilty by reason of insanity for killing his wife, Monica. A judge subsequently required Morin to be sent to a Western state hospital and not to have any contact with Monica Morin's family, including their son. Tell us a little bit about these state hospitals here. I mean, this isn't a prison, correct? I mean, he's going to be in a mental health facility. It's locked down, but not prison.
It's locked down, right? And his movement is mitigated, of course, but in no way is it a state prison. This is really a step up from that facility, from staying in a state prison. So is that the motive for him to be able to stay there? Why would they bring this defense?
100%, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
and perhaps more than that. Perhaps if he's well one day, he might get out.
And a step above that, right? The whole family's biggest fear, and one of my biggest fears with this sentencing, he is still able to maintain custody of his kid.
Yeah,
he doesn't lose that. How does that happen?
Now we're going from the confusing to the offensive, but you're absolutely right.
It is offensive. Yes.
As offended and bothered we are by this, you can understand how Monica's family was unhappy with the verdict. The judge addressed the court saying, "I'm sure many of you feel this is not justice, but sometimes the job I have is not to make the most popular decision, but to make a decision on the basis of the law." Fine, Judge, I get it. Monica's sister, Gina Kimberlin, addressed the court after Michael's sentence. She spoke about the multiple systematic failures that led to her sister's death, noting that many times that Monica attempted to report abuse to authorities despite Michael never being charged with a crime. Holding up a picture of her sister's gravesite, if you can imagine this, Gina told Michael, "This is how your son visits his mother now." Absolutely devastating sort of stuff for the family. Gina and her husband are reportedly seeking to adopt, to your point, Lewis, Monica's son, hoping to solidify his well-being and in the future. Michael will remain in Western State Hospital potentially for the rest of his life. Lewis, I'll let you have the last word on this one. Was this justice served or not? I think I already know your answer.
No, absolutely not. I think the judge had discretion here, for starters, and he chose to not fight the battle and not try to move this thing forward to protect the child. If anything, protect the child, right? And that child should have a permanent restraining order, at least till he's 18.
Yeah.
His dad. Dad should not be able to have any legal means to get to that kid,
Yeah.
because you've already set the pattern here, that all he has to do is declare another prophecy and he'll be fine.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to worry about anything.
I am a big fan of law enforcement and of our judicial system. I think that we are doing the best that we possibly can, but you see cases like this and it really starts to frustrate you and make you question on whether or not, I think certainly here, the system failed this poor woman and her whole family and the son, who will have to live with those nightmares for the rest of his life. All right, moving on to our next case. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez was arrested in Tulsa, Oklahoma after an alleged crime spree that began in El Salvador and spread across the United States. He stands accused of the murder of a Salvadorian woman, the home invasion, which included an attack on a 9-year-old and her mother, as well as the murder of Rachel Morin. According to authorities, Victor began his crime spree in January of 2023 with a killing in his native El Salvador. Currently, officials have not released many details on that alleged murder, though it is believed that the victim in that case was also a woman. Later that month, Victor allegedly entered the United States to escape prosecution in El Salvador. Reportedly, Victor entered the United States on 2 different occasions that month, through borders in El Paso and New Mexico. However, he was eventually identified, leading him to attempt a 3rd entrance into the country. Then, get this, Lewis, in February of 2023, Victor again allegedly came to the United States for a 4th time. He somehow avoided border detection. He was able to openly roam around for 16 months, leaving a string of victims and crime in his wake. This case has had a lot of political heat, I'll put it, lately. And sure. I don't want to get into that as much as it is astounding to me to see, at least with this person, it seems like him getting back and forth between into the U.S. from Mexico and having traveled from El Salvador was not all that difficult for him.
No, he has perfected it. And look, I agree. There will be those out there who want to make this political for whatever reason. But I do want to comment on that only because from the aspect that I have worked those borders myself in my law enforcement career over 25 years. And when I started back in 1984, Josh, and I got my first assignment out there, drug interdiction, one of the things that became very obvious at the beginning was how extremely porous our borders were back in 1984. And through the years, I've just noticed that they become more and more and more porous because they're perfecting, even though we're trying to catch up ourselves, we're improving our security, attempting, those who want to come across, they're perfecting how to do that. And there's so many things to fight, not just, putting up some type of barrier or technology to try to prevent that or at least slow it down. But we've worked many cases where you have officers who work the borders on both sides who are subject to bribery, to corruption, and facilitate the crossing for thousands every day. You have people at the local DMV to help that also are corrupt. Cases that I've worked in the past. This is an ongoing problem that was in place before 1984, but I've seen it consistent through the years to this day. DMV is willing to, if you know the right person, to issue a fake ID. To certain individuals, and so they can hide in public. It's just incredible how, I don't know what the right answer is, but it's from many different directions, and I'm afraid it's going to continue to increase unless we change something. I don't know what the answer to that is, but yeah, I see it. It's porous, and he's perfected it himself.
Yeah, and along to dovetail off of what you said too, his reason was obviously to escape capture for a crime he had already committed. And you got to think about his mindset is, if I make it to the U.S., I can disappear. I mean, that's a scary thought that he knows, like you said, it's not going to be all that difficult for him to find a fake identity, to assume being a different person. He's got no history. Nobody knows him who's here that we know of, I'm saying. And he's able to essentially just disappear into the U.S. And that's one thing, but now then he takes it upon himself to go about continuing his crime spree of violence here in the United States. Scary stuff. Talking about it being porous, this is one of the aspects of it that I think concerns people of all political bent. This is a problem. Yeah. In March of 2023, Victor is alleged to have assaulted, and this is what we were talking about, a 9-year-old and her mother in a home invasion in Los Angeles. In the crime, the assailant left behind a water bottle and a hat, which authorities were able to use to obtain a DNA sample. This is going to become important in a moment here. A doorbell camera video of the incident was also obtained, which also becomes important that we'll talk about. And the way that this plays out chronologically is maybe not the way that a lot of us learned about this case. Because according to authorities, Victor's next victim was 37-year-old mother of 5, Rachel Morin. The body of Rachel Morin was discovered on a Maryland hiking trail known as the Ma and Pa Trail on August 6, 2023. Around a day after her boyfriend reported her missing, authorities believe she was murdered on August 5th. All right, so that case breaks, and it makes a lot of news because I think it's, again, one of those things where it's a nightmare when anyone is just kind of going about their day and then they disappear and then they end up killed in a very violent and awful way. But now we're learning that he had actually committed a crime that didn't lead to murder. It was violent nonetheless beforehand. And the reason I was curious to hear your thoughts on this is if you could tell us about why on those crimes that sometimes don't get as much attention, the police work is just as important because they may be preventing someone early on from committing far more egregious crimes.
Yeah. So when I hear that question, and we get that a lot apparently, I think of Gabby Petito,
Yes.
right? Blonde hair, blue eyes, and she got national attention. And it was a very horrible case, absolutely. But there are many, many, many others that are just as horrible, if not even worse. And of course, that's subjective, but they don't get the attention. And some of the consistency there is... it's just a different demographic.
I think you make an important point that it is, I think, a function of the media. It's kind of, I think, also a function of what stands out to us culturally as being, an anomaly, that you hear about a crime taking place in a suburban area on a hiking trail, and that's obviously going to get a little more coverage than a crime taking place in what we would consider a quote-unquote high crime area. And you're right to see that kind of dichotomy here. And I think my point, too, is that the detectives working that case in L.A. with the home invasion and the assault on that 9-year-old girl, you can be sure they are taking that incredibly seriously. Because though that didn't lead to murder, they already know that this person is a very dangerous person and they want to do something about it. And that's why it is important to dedicate resources and time to those types of cases that may not make media headlines, because perhaps that could have prevented had he been captured. And I'm not saying it was a shortcoming of law enforcement, but had he been apprehended, they may have prevented this murder that then took place in Maryland.
Right. And, I actually think on this case, law enforcement, in the location, the tracking, and the apprehension of this clown, that they did a pretty damn good job.
Yeah.
Right. And because of the work in LA, collecting the DNA and understand they had a very violent crime. And I think somewhere shortly after that, they were able to get a pretty good idea of who he was, especially after they got the familial DNA.
You're 100% right. That is what was kind of the linchpin turning point in this whole thing that I want to get into. One last point on this before I kind of give us more of how this case played out is I was astounded at the fact that we know he gets into the U.S., then he somehow makes his way to Los Angeles. Then he makes his way from Los Angeles to Maryland, across the entire country. This is a person who we don't know yet, but I can't imagine has means of making a lot of money. Was that surprising to you, his ability to kind of just travel freely about the country?
Well, I'm 50-50. I mean,
Okay.
he's established. I think he knows how to get around here. And if he does have a history in El Salvador of being part of a cartel organization or a gang organization, and they're established here in the U.S., that's what they do. They
Hmm.
perfect how to get people from point A to point B. So he may have had another reason, and this was just something he was doing in the middle of whatever else he was here for, whether it's
Trafficking,
trafficking
perhaps? Is that where?
or
Yeah. Oh,
yeah, yeah.
interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Really
Yeah.
good point.
So who?
You're right. You're right. That could have been a business trip from
Yeah.
L.A. to Maryland for him.
Right.
Interesting.
And they do try to color it, and maybe it is, part of it could be that he was trying to escape what happened in El Salvador. But this may have been a trip he has made many times to the U.S. already over the years. And I think also, I said crime spree. I think what we're going to find that's going to come to fruition as the investigation continues is that there's other people who are victims of his while
Yeah.
he was here, especially
Yeah.
with the DNA hit.
I think you're
And have
right.
identified. So that's all going to start coming out. It's hard to
This
believe that he behaved.
No, like 100%. Given the randomness of at least the two that we know about here in the U.S. To fill that out a little bit more, investigators hypothesized that Victor was hiding on an adjacent trail to where the mother was hiking and eventually attacked Rachel before leaving the state. Authorities have not disclosed how Rachel was killed or if there was a weapon involved. However, according to her family, Rachel had suffered severe trauma, and it looked like, and this is a quote, that they believed her head had been smashed in with a rock. So just one of the worst ways she could have met her end. And it also shows, I think, that this was perhaps a crime, and maybe you can flesh this out a little bit more for me, Lewis, a crime that wasn't entirely planned, but perhaps some compulsiveness was involved in it. What do you think?
Oh, I think he's got a serial nature to him, and yeah,
Yeah.
crime of opportunity. But he went to an isolated place on purpose. He couldn't control it. It was an urge that he had to fulfill. So that's why
Yeah.
the chances are high that there was a trail behind him,
Yeah.
and very high that capturing him, his capture prevented future because he was not going to stop. In fact, it seemed like his violent encounters were increasing.
Yeah. Urge is the right word. This person was definitely acting off of impulses inside of him. Just over 2 weeks after Rachel's death in late August of 2023, investigators released a video from the attack in LA in connection with the mother's murder, asking the public for help identifying the suspect. The alleged assailant was described as a Hispanic male, 5'9", between 20 and 30, with a muscular frame and dark hair. This was where I really started to get involved in this case because it was amazing to me that through DNA, they were able to match it to this assault in LA, and then they had videotape. And it wasn't enough to flat out say who this was, but it was enough to get an idea of what this person looked like. Investigators used DNA evidence collected from the assault in Los Angeles to identify Rachel's alleged murderer. With DNA taken from the victim, detectives were able to utilize familial DNA, as you pointed out, to identify a small pool of relatives. Reportedly, agents with the FBI even traveled to El Salvador as part of their investigation. If you want to think resources were put behind this, you're right. Lewis, there is still a lot to be learned about this investigation, how it was pieced together and all the details. But one thing we do know is that familial DNA, or what's called investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, was used in this. Tell us about that. What is that? How does it work?
Well, you early on, and I think people are starting to understand now because you hear this more and more. DNA was really straight to the specific individual. It would identify a specific individual, but familial is right. It'll give you the family tree behind that individual. So if you can identify just a family member, right, and could help point your investigation in a certain direction. Of course, you're corroborating that with other evidence, other leads that you have. I think this case is interesting because with that familial DNA, they identified a circle of family that lived in that area. They were able to develop from that where he was going to be exactly at a certain time. I want to say it was 11 p.m. at night when they finally arrested him sitting on a bar stool.
Yeah.
They knew he was going to be there. So someone was working very closely with the FBI, right, to pass that information because they ended up calling Oklahoma PD to say he's there now or is going to be there.
Yeah.
So I think
Excellent point.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like they may have had help. That's a really, really good point. To the points that you were making, after narrowing down the list of potential suspects, detectives zeroed in on Victor in May of 2024, eventually tracking his location to the Tulsa area. Again, now we've gone from LA to Maryland to now Oklahoma. FBI agents contacted Tulsa detectives sometime in the evening of June 13th, 2024, telling them they had credible information of the suspect's location, perhaps a tip-off. On Friday, June 14th, 2024, Victor was arrested in Tulsa at around 11:30 p.m. at a bar. Pretty incredible, though, right, Lewis, that after all of this, tracing a person all over the country and in fact into other countries and all the resources and everything else, this doesn't end up in some sort of car chase or a shootout, but they just casually arrest him as he's sitting at a bar. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a lot of luck in that, and strategic planning, tactical planning. Let's get him. They probably send someone in there. He's at the bar, sitting in there right now. All right, let's go get him. I mean, they probably try to mitigate anything like that if they could. Absolutely. If he would have been pulled over, if he was in a stolen vehicle or they would have attempted, chances are he would have run and it would have ended in a violent encounter. I was going to ask you, he was arrested at the bar for this outstanding homicide, but he was also arrested for trespassing in that bar. What's up with that?
Yeah. I guess they figured if the murder charge didn't stick, they still had something on him. I saw that too, and it was curious to me. And I'm wondering if it was more about their probable cause to make the arrest, that they felt like, okay, if anything else, we can lock this person up and hold them for this trespassing. And then while he's in custody, confirm with the FBI and everybody else, is this in fact your man, before they charge him with murder, was my only thought of how that may have played out. But that was funny to me as well, because he denied being involved or who he was, obviously, but they may not have been able to completely ID him at that point until the FBI got involved. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez, these guys invert these names 20 different ways, at least, right? Who knows what other names, aliases he used. So very difficult. It came down to the DNA hit and potentially some prints from El Salvador. To this, but for the trespassing, it's still touched on a little bit, but don't they have to get the owner of the bar to say he's not welcome here, or we have a history, he won't leave, he's been here all day?
Yeah.
Right?
Who knows? Maybe his defense attorney will get that charge dismissed. Who knows?
Maybe, or maybe Josh, he'll come up with some type of prophecy and just walk away from the whole thing.
Exactly. That seems to be the flavor of the day as to what people are using. On June 17th, 2024, Victor waived his right to an extradition hearing to face charges in Harford County, Maryland. Victor faces counts of first-degree murder and first-degree rape in the death of Rachel Morin. After his arrest, Harford County Sheriff Jeff Galler gave a press conference in which he criticized federal border security. The man opined American citizens are not safe because of failed immigration policies. This was kind of what we touched on earlier. It's hard when you have cases like this to not see politics get involved in the whole thing. I think, Lewis, you had made some excellent points about, regardless where you come out on this politically, this is obviously a failure if a person like this is able to get in and commit further violence inside of the U.S. But again, I'll give you kind of the last thoughts on this, Lewis. What do you think about how this played out, especially coming from a law enforcement background? I'm just really want to take a moment to applaud the efforts that were put into this.
I agree. I think that I don't want that to get swept under here either. I think there was some excellent police work, starting back in Los Angeles. They cared. They knew what they had there, the potential of someone who inflicted that type of violent harm on the 9-year-old and her mom. Could do if they were still on the loose. And I think that's going to come also out at what exactly happened there. Because it with what they did let out, trust me, we both know it was probably even worse what happened there. Yeah. So I kudos to them for at least getting the DNA and putting it in the database in CODIS. Because many times, sometimes they don't grab DNA. It's hard to believe, but that happens still to this day in some of our larger departments. But what happens even more, they'll grab the DNA and not put it in CODIS, right?
Yeah.
And they did. And because of that, there was a connection made based on some incredible boots on the ground work by the arresting agencies.
Yeah, it's incredible that in this modern day and age where everything is on databases and everything seems to be accessible everywhere, that law enforcement still has some catching up to do in some respect. That there's a lot of times where these databases are not speaking to each other. Different states are not sharing information with each other. I know I experienced this in the DA's office where, you may run a person's background, quote unquote, and find out, different convictions, but that may be limited to California or the jurisdiction that you're in. And it takes some work and undertaking to really thoroughly find out, did this person have other run-ins with law enforcement outside of the state that you're practicing in? So you're right. Sounds like the stars aligned enough in this case for them to make an incredible capture, and we're glad that they did. And we will, of course, keep you all updated as we have further information on this case. All right. Well, that is our show for this week. Louis, thank you so much for being my guest, for holding my hand through all of this as we fill in for Anna. Where can people find out more about you?
Thank you, Josh. Thank you so much. You can find my entire social media footprint at getbitinvestigations.com.
Fantastic. And I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on more true crime cases, please check out my new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. You can find our episodes wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our True Crime News channel on YouTube, and sign up to receive our newsletter at truecrimenews.com. Thank you all for letting me join you this week. Until next week, this is True Crime News, the podcast reminding you, don't do crime.